All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth WorkSmart Recovery, Innovation, and Access Workshop. Dr. Brea Heidelberg is returning today to talk about assessing progress. My name is Danielle Stovey, Arts Education Manager with Arts Fairfax. I would like to go ahead and start by acknowledging that Arts Fairfax is located on the traditional lands of the Manahoic Nation and pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This land was stolen by English explorers in the 1600s, and because of raids by enemy Iroquois tribes and infectious disease from European contact, the last remaining Manahoic people likely joined the neighboring Monacan tribe. This is a land acknowledgement that I have just modeled and is one of the ways we can be more inclusive in our programming. Other actions we've modeled during the workshop series have included the use of pronouns, physical descriptions, and closed captioning. At this time, please rename yourself with your name, organization, and pronouns. And please double check that your microphone is muted. If you have any questions, please include them in the chat. This session is being recorded, and we will have the recording available soon on our website. And if you've missed any of our previous workshops, you can find them on our website. We also have live closed captioning available that you can turn on by clicking the up arrow next to closed captioning and select Show Subtitle. I would now like to introduce our President and CEO, Linda Sullivan, who will say a few words of welcome.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for participating in this workshop, and hopefully you all have been able to participate in this whole series. It's been, I think, just such a successful series, and I want to thank Dr. Brea Heidelberg for leading us through all of this diversity and inclusivity discussion. I think we've gotten a lot out of it, and I know we have, and I hope you all have too. I'd also like to make a big shout out and thanks to Danielle, who is leaving us for Boston University at the end of the month. She's going to graduate school. But Danielle, you've done a fabulous job on this workshop series, as well as the Artist in Residency program, the Arts for Life, and all the other things you've been doing with us. And thank you so much. Great job. And we wish you well, and we're going to stay in touch. So everyone, I hope enjoy this, and I'm going to mute myself now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Linda. All right, I'm going to share my screen one more time. Okay. And scroll down here. So I want to go ahead and just share some of our goals for the WorkSmart workshop series. Our goal is to build capacity of arts organizations and artists to engage people in arts and culture by increasing knowledge and understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. So we hope that through this series, we've been able to provide resources and expertise geared to the unique challenges and opportunities of Fairfax County, provide practical tools to advance DEIA and Fairfax through the arts, learn together and from each other, and in the process, build new relationships and model those best practices. I now want to introduce our presenter for today. As many of you have probably already gotten a chance to know Brea. She's going to be presenting for the first hour, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions and discussions. Brea is an arts management educator, consultant, and researcher focusing on the intersection of the arts and other fields of study. She serves as an associate professor and program director at Drexel University. She also founded ISO Arts Consulting, which focuses on human resources issues in the nonprofits arts, particularly issues to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you so much, Brea, and we're thrilled to have you back to facilitate today's session.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to jump right in so that we have ample time for question and discussions. I just wanted to say up front that there's going to be so much space for that because I know that this is going to be a like a meatier topic. So I just wanted to give you the heads up that we'll have a lot of time for that. Okay. So as you are coming in and getting settled, I just want to remind those of you who have been here before and those for whom this is the first session, I do keep the chat box open, so please feel free to type in any questions that come up in real time. And if it's something that I think should be addressed right then, I totally will. If it's something that I know I'm going to get to, I will try my best to make sure that I acknowledge that before, after you've typed something in. So we're going to talk about equitable evaluation, and we're going to do some brief introduction and ground rules, talk about the types of evaluation, evaluation questions, collecting data, evaluation use, and questions and discussion. We have a limited amount of time today, so I'm not going to do a deep dive into how to analyze data, but happy to answer specific questions that you might have. So, some discussion agreements for today. We are creating and maintaining a brave space, which means as we think about the equity part of evaluation or infusing equity into your current evaluation practices, it may cause you to need to be in a vulnerable space in order to work through that process. And that's okay. That's part of creating and maintaining a brave space. As we are having this discussion, which will mostly occur amongst each other in the chat function, make sure you're focusing on your own experiences and using I statements. For those that do share, we'll keep the stories here, the lessons can go. And that just means that we won't be sharing specific information that is shared in this space, except that there are many lived experiences. So the ways in which you might have engaged with the more equitably infused evaluation practices or previous evaluation practices that have not been particularly equitable, that may or may not be the exact same as somebody else's lived experience. Be mindful of the people that you may not always see. So, I use the metaphor in your blind spot. So, as you're driving along in your car, you might see most of the cars if you look in the mirrors that you're used to looking into. But you have to also check for your blind spot, especially if you're changing lanes or trying to change your behaviors or practices, so that you don't actually hit somebody that might have been operating in your blind spot for an extended period of time. And give yourself some grace as we work through this process, both in the conversation today and afterwards. We are all unfinished masterpieces. So, as was mentioned before, my name is Brea Heidelberg, and the way that I come to evaluation is from conducting many evaluations, both for organizations that I've been a part of and as an external consultant. I did a focused program, graduate like minor in evaluation studies from Claremont Graduate University, and I really just like looking at all the different types of evaluation processes that exist and fine tuning them to fit a particular organization and their overarching goals. So, why are we even conducting evaluations? Some people hate them because they just seem like there's something that you have to do for funders, and that they might not have any particular utility for you individually or for your organization. But they are designed to provide information that will help decision makers to improve the quality of whatever it is that you're evaluating, increasing organizational knowledge about what it is that you do, prioritizing resources in the current time and in the future, aligning outcomes with organizational priorities, improving accountability both for internal and external stakeholders, and advocating for increased and or improved resources. So evaluations are really just data gathering and data refining processes that you can use to help make decisions that will improve your overall organizational structure and life and ways of being. Things that can be evaluated, because sometimes we forget that it's a bit of like a, I forget what the Russian dolls are called, but you can evaluate things and they can evaluate things inside of those things. So you can look at programs, you can look at processes that exist within your organization. So most people tend to think about evaluation from a programmatic perspective, but it also behooves many organizations to engage in process evaluation. If your organization engages in any sort of products, and I'm using the term product very broadly. This includes your performances, if you sell things, if you have associated swag or materials that go along with whatever your organization does as its primary focus. All of that can have evaluation attached to it. You can also have evaluation tied to systems and people. When it comes to people, we tend to think of things like performance reviews. So you can go ahead and drop in the chat. What do you hope to get out of today? And I'll keep an eye on that as I continue on in the presentation. So types of evaluation that exist. So there's two main forms of evaluation, and there are subsets that exist under each of those forms. But the two main ways to think about evaluation are formative evaluation. And this is, I'm going to talk about evaluation from the programmatic perspective, but keep in mind that there's all these other types of evaluation as well. But formative evaluation is conducted to aid program or process improvement in process. So formative evaluation is happening while the program or the process is occurring. Some guiding questions as you think about formative evaluation include: what are the barriers to implementation? So what has been difficult about the process that you're evaluating? Um, how effective are the program's activities that you're engaging in? How might we increase engagement or participation? How prepared are staff to do whatever it is that we're evaluating? How might implementation be refined? And what is working well? Um, I encourage you, as you think about evaluation, to not only think about what might need to change or what's going wrong, but to also do some excavating and some critical reflection on the things that are working, rather than just relying on that magic happening again. You do need to track what is actually going right so that you can replicate it in future. Summative evaluation is conducted to determine and assess a completed program or process. So this is often a goals-oriented evaluation, and you're looking at things like, did the program meet its goals? Were the results worth the cost, right? Thinking about cost benefit analysis, which is a form of evaluation, and thinking about the parts of the program that might be easily replicable. So the first part of any evaluation, once you determine what it is that you're going to evaluate, is developing evaluation questions. You have to keep in mind your overarching goal, which is to provide information that will assist with future decision-making processes. Evaluation questions should be simple, useful, and easily understood among all involved stakeholders. So what I mean by that is, sometimes when we think about evaluation questions, they tend to be everything and the kitchen sink. We want to evaluate this and this and this and this. And you can have separate evaluation questions, but each one individually should be relatively simple and easy to comprehend. They should also have direct utility to the decision-making process, right? So most organizations have evaluation tied to grant-funded programs, and evaluation is often a requirement whenever you receive public funding of any sort. Thinking about ways in which to use those evaluation requirements to the benefit of the organization is really important. So you have to identify your stakeholders in order to have a fully fleshed out evaluation question and plan. Thinking about who is involved in the creation and implementation. If you have internal and maybe contract or consulting staff, make sure you incorporate everyone in these evaluation conversations and not just a subset of who's involved in the creation and implementation, because you might miss some important elements. Think holistically about who is served and or impacted by the program. So most programs are going to have a tiered structure of served or impacted, right? So if you think about a dance class for, let's say, fifth graders, well, you're directly serving those fifth graders who are participating in a dance class, but a secondary population that you're also serving and impacting would be the parents or the caregivers that are directly connected to those participants in the class. Right. There might even be a tertiary impact of if you're renting space, right? That partner, they may be impacted by the program. So really think holistically whenever you're asking yourself these guiding questions. Finally, who makes decisions about the program? And think about what that means in practice. So you've got everyday your internal staff who's probably making a lot of the everyday decisions, managerial or executive level staff who might be making different types of decisions, board of directors who have budget oversight and fiduciary responsibilities. They might also be a factor that you want to consider. When people are starting out with evaluations, especially for programs, I strongly encourage the development and use of a logic model. Barring that, these guiding questions are usually very helpful to think about in addition to the who questions that were on the previous slide. So, thinking about what the process or the program is intended to do and the context within which that intended impact is supposed to take place. Thinking about when does the activity occur, and if you're making changes that you're evaluating, when does that change start to occur as well? Thinking about why the effort that you're putting in, the process, the program, the individuals, why are they important to your organization or community? And what might it be important to people in why might it be important to people in other organizations or communities as well? So thinking about the broad reaching impact of potential impact of what it is that you're looking at. And finally, the how part. So how is it going to create this impact? um, this is an example of a logic model, and the teeny tiny print that you can't read isn't important. I mean, it is, in the in the grand scheme of things, but thinking about the categories at the top, it's really important to investigate the assumptions that are underneath the rest of the ways in which you have created your program or process. So once you get a list of those together, thinking about the inputs that are going to be required in order to put on the program, the activities that are associated, ideally the outputs and the outcomes, and the overarching impact. These are things that we tend to discuss relatively informally, at the very least within organizations. We're really sitting down and having multiple conversations about how this should map out and how it should map out over time is a really important way to be able to identify what I like to think of as intervention points for evaluation. So, if you have all of this laid out, when you're thinking about all of those guiding questions, you can begin to pinpoint where you might want to conduct an evaluative um, uh, process. Do you want to be asking questions about the inputs and resources? Do you have questions about the activities, or do you want to assess the activities? Are you only interested in the outputs and outcomes, or are you primarily focused on the impact? Where on along this logic map you are interested in investigating will dictate the types of questions that you ask, the type of collection methods that you use, and the ways in which you might want to report out the results. So, when you think about SMART goals, you can apply that logic to SMART evaluation as well. You can be thinking very intelligently or reflectively about specific outputs and outcomes that clearly state the issue of focus, the target group, and the time frame. Measurable outputs and outcomes are ones where you can clearly assess the change that has occurred. Keep in mind that some of this might be defining out things that people tend to want you to evaluate, right? So, one space where I see this really coming to a head as far as the SMART approach versus what people would like to see assessments about would be equity focused work, right? We tend to think of evaluation as I need to prove that I created some change. That might be easier to do for, say, like a workshop setting like this, a pre and post test evaluation process in which I give you some sort of assessment at the beginning of the workshop to say what's your prior knowledge and experience and feelings about the topic or the overarching goals of what I want you to achieve or know at the end of the workshop. And then a post test to assess the differences between who you were and how you thought whenever you came into the workshop, and who you are and how you think on the back end of it. So that's one example of a very specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time specific approach to something that might be equity focused. However, when it comes to overarching things like diversifying your audience, which, as if you've seen some of the previous workshops, I've said isn't the best overarching goal because it's not specific enough. But if you're trying to assess things like that, it's it can be fairly difficult to do in the short term. You might see a sudden uptick in the different types of people that are coming into your organization based on a specific type of programming, but the overarching impact of relationship building has tend to have a pretty significant time lag. So when it comes to equity focused evaluations, it's really important to dive deeply into that logic model idea, because there are going to be some evaluation questions that, based on the time relevance and based on when you would expect to see some of the outcomes that you're hoping for, simply don't make sense at the time, and are something that you might want to assess in a year or so or multiple years down the line. Things like relationship building take time, and so it's really important that your evaluation questions align with what's going to be available for you as data points. Which brings me to my next point, collecting data. So I'm going to give you an overview of the some considerations and some pitfalls that I've seen, because there are so many different ways of collecting data for evaluation purposes that it could be an entire program, and we do have limited time today. So data collection considerations. And this is important if you're doing something like a survey or a focus group, which again are just a small subset of the overarching options there. But don't be noticeably invested in getting a positive or negative response from the people that you're working with that are involved in the evaluation process. That can bias individuals towards either definitely providing or actively working to not provide those responses, right? So I know that seems like a very it might be a difficult thing to do. It's an evaluation that you're conducting for your organization. You are invested in the outcomes, but working to remain a sense of neutrality when collecting the data is really important. If you don't think that that's something that you can do, find somebody on staff that can, or outsource the data collection process. Keep in mind that data collectors cannot be, and when I say data collectors, I mean somebody that's either conducting the survey or the focus group or the interviews or whatever method you choose. They cannot be somebody that a participant feels compelled to please. So, if it's somebody that has the power to provide or withhold services, somebody that they have a deep connection with. So sometimes, if it's a teacher student a teacher-student relationship, having that teacher conduct a one-on-one interview might not be the best way to collect the data. Having a third party come in would be ideal, or an independent survey or something other than putting the respondent in a position where it's a really problematic power, a potentially problematic power differential. When you're collecting data, it's important to have the skills to interact respectfully with respondents. So this is why it's really important to have very simple evaluation questions, because that tends to lead to simple and direct forms of data collection. This helps prevent you from either purposefully or accidentally speaking down to participants because you hold all of this knowledge and they do not, allegedly. Make sure that you're practicing cultural competence. So learn the engagement norms of the participants that you hope to gather information from. So for example, don't assume that everybody greets each other with a handshake or a hug, even, once we get into the after times, whenever that might be, because that might set them ill at ease and you've already sort of tainted your data. Finally, and this is really important, whatever evaluation protocol that you set up as far as the questions that you're going to ask and the order that you're going to ask those questions, or the ways in which you administer the survey. Is it right after a performance? Do you give people a pen? Do you give them a clipboard? How do you introduce the survey to potential participants? Whatever that protocol is, make sure that you're able to follow those instructions and the protocols consistently. One way to sort of have wonky data, or data that doesn't actually tell you what it is that you're trying to find out, is if you've got multiple people saying and doing different things with different people throughout the data collection process. When you add the equity piece on top of it, there are some other things that you need to consider. So, being mindful of past experiences with researchers and evaluators for the constituents that you're dealing with. As we're aware, there have been increased call for equity work and considerations. There has been an increase in funding for organizations and researchers in this area. And so there may be populations or stakeholders that are exhausted from being evaluated and asked so many questions, as people begin to, in many instances, or continue to in some instances, uh, try to find ways to engage historically excluded and marginalized, or currently excluded and marginalized communities. So it really does require you to do a little bit of research and critical self-reflection on the past experiences that whomever it is that you're trying to get data information from has had with researchers and evaluators. Think carefully about logistical and other challenges they, meaning people you want to either interview or engage with, face if they must travel to participate. So things like the timing of data collection. Do people have transportation to your space? How many buses might they need to take to get there? Are they comfortable getting on the bus? Are there ways to provide, if you're going to do a focus group or interviews, are you providing childcare during that time to increase um, the swath of people that you would have access to? Be thinking about how the logistics of your data collection process might privilege certain types of voices over others. Review your protocol with an eye towards equity and cultural norms. So there may be certain cultures for which women participants would not feel comfortable having a male data collector and they would be in the room alone with them. There might be certain protocols that might make people uncomfortable based on the ways in which they normally engage in community settings. Isolated prolonged eye contact it can be uncomfortable for people on the autism spectrum, right? So review your protocol with an eye towards cultural competence and equity for the populations that you hope to engage with. Being sensitive to language differences is really important, especially those that could cause discomfort or misunderstandings. So, if you are speaking with a constituency for whom English is not a first language, consider an interpreter. Um, Even if the person does have conversational English as a second or third or fourth language, you want to make sure that you're catching nuances and that you're having idiomatic phrases that might come up as a part of the natural conversation or the interview, the evaluation protocol. You want to make sure that that's actually being conveyed in the ways that you mean to to those that you're collecting data from. Specific turns of phrases or colloquialisms that might be common knowledge to you and those in your organization, but might be off putting or simply misunderstood by those that are operating outside of your organizational context. You should also be reviewing for those in your practices. And finally, this is one thing that lots of people forget, but it's something that I always focus on. Consider the literacy level of any materials that you're releasing. Um, you should strive for a sixth grade reading level whenever you're developing surveys or written pieces of information that are a part of your evaluation protocol. This also includes the language that you would use to explain the process to potential participants. Otherwise, you risk getting incomplete or incorrect or just false data because somebody might not have the literacy level required if you're writing your questions as if though you're going to be on Jeopardy. And for those that might not be able to read or write with complete fluency in English, you might miss out on some really rich data. So, two other things that are important to consider that I see organizations sometimes forget are consent. And it's important to get informed consent from participants. So, this requires you to inform them of what you are asking them to do. So, we're asking you to provide feedback on this particular type of programming, the benefits, and if there are any potential risks for their participation, who will see the data and how the data will be used. So as a result of being a part of this focus group today, our internal evaluator is going to have access to this data, and we are going to use it to seek additional grant funding, but your name won't necessarily be used or your comments won't be directly attributed. Give people the full extent of the full lay of the land whenever they are thinking about engaging in your evaluation process. You should also be upfront about how much time it will take for them to answer the questions. So if you are doing an online survey, including that ticker bar at the bottom to let them know how close they are to completing. If it's a focus group, there should be a very finite temporal timestamp on that. So it's going to be a 30-minute focus group and stick to that, just to give people a full understanding of how much of a time commitment it's going to be. Also, you should let people know that their participation is voluntary and that they can decline or stop in the middle of the process if it makes them uncomfortable. Providing all of this information up front has been shown to provide more fruitful, expansive responses as participants have some comfort in knowing the ways in which the information that they're sharing is going to be used. You also need to make some decisions up front about whether or not the information that is provided to you is going to be either anonymous or confidential. So, anonymity requires that you and the evaluator do not know who participants are. This could be survey data, this could be if somebody else is conducting an interview or a focus group and you just see the data afterwards as the information is transcribed. But for instance, you wouldn't ask any respondents to put their names on a survey or identify themselves in a focus group. Confidentiality, on the other hand, means that you and those who are evaluating the data do know who the participants are, but you don't link their identity to their responses. So any information that you have contains the person's name or personal information that must be kept in a locked drawer or stored with a password in an electronic file. There are going to be some instances where you're not able to offer either anonymity or confidentiality, and that should be a part of the consent conversation. So, evaluation use. Lack of use is one of the biggest problems in evaluation and strategic plans, many of which have served as beautiful paperweights and doorstops over the years. Hopefully you're actively working against that, as encouraging use of evaluation information throughout the organization is an important part of the process. So there are a couple different types of ways that evaluation outcomes can be used. The instrumental use is, okay, we're going to continue doing this thing. We are going to increase our resources that we're applying toward it. Conceptual use is, okay, we've had proof of concept of this program or this process, and as a result of that, we're going to use that to inform what we decide to do moving forward. It might not be directly related to the actual program, but we're using the underlying assumptions and conceptualizations of a thought or a process moving forward. Symbolic use is often what people tend to use it for, when use evaluation outcomes for, whenever they're doing it solely for the purpose of a grant funder or your year-end evaluations. You're not really incorporating that information back into the organization per se, but it's more about externally demonstrating that you did the evaluation and what the outcomes were. Finally, process is when you're using the evaluation mainly to inform the ways in which you go about doing your work moving forward. So there are a couple of ways to communicate results: written formats, reports, newsletters, letters, verbal formats, presentations, or sharing circles. And then there's also websites, webinars, podcasts, and other electronic formats. But since many of our organizations are arts based, I also wanted to introduce you to some trends with arts based reporting. This has been great to expand the ways in which evaluation use can be demonstrated to organizations and constituents and stakeholders for whom sitting down and reading a report is not likely. So things like theater, actors performing aspects of the findings and then encouraging a talkback session, photography to help illustrate the more human aspects that are corresponding to the data. Storybooks are a visually appealing way of reporting finders that still adheres to the somewhat traditional evaluation of reporting norms. And then movement-based reporting, using the body to physically articulate aspects of your finding or communicate results that are body-based. So all of those are really great ways of expanding the reach of your use outside of the traditional report-based way. So, just to make sure that we're gonna do a breakout and then come back, but some final notes are to watch out for bias and evaluation questions and methods. And this is one of those things where it's really helpful to have as many eyes and ears as possible on your evaluation questions and the ways in which you're going to conduct your evaluation. If you're operating in relative isolation in your organization, meaning you work in a small or mid-sized organization and there aren't many people to chat with, I encourage you to find community or communities that you already are a part of in order to sort of vet some of the things that you're thinking about doing and getting some feedback. Also, watch out for things that are interesting versus useful. So, as I mentioned before, your evaluation question and processes should be in service of gathering data upon which you'll base later decisions off of. That means that things that might be interesting are not necessarily going to be useful. And thinking about how that manifests itself in your evaluation questions and process will help prevent you from those really long, cumbersome, difficult to understand evaluation questions. Evaluation noise is something to watch out for. So what I mean by that is sometimes you're looking at the impact of a particular program. Say it's a arts-based literacy program. You're looking at primarily the increase in literacy level. It might also be interesting to see if it has some impact on social engagement of participants. But if that's not your primary focus and that's not what you're going to be, using for later decision making, that can actually create noise that might shift your focus from your primary evaluation question and might skew the data. If you would like to look at both things, having separate evaluation questions and maybe related, but still separate evaluation protocols is key there. Sometimes people that are not directly related to the evaluation will ask questions like, can we also figure out, you know what, we're doing a survey about this, but I was also interested in how people felt about this other unrelated thing. Can we throw a couple of questions on the survey to ask about that? The answer should be no. People will get survey fatigue. It will be jarring to be directed towards a completely different, like, part of your lived experience with an organization. So be very mindful of the can we also figure out or can we also ask about. Finally, doing a lot of the work up front about the ways in which you would engage in evaluation is important because there are ripple effects if you decide to change evaluations midstream. So thinking, really purposefully about the process that you're going to go through, excuse me, is important so that you're not altering your protocols halfway through the process when you may have already collected some data from some individuals. You're thinking about, as I mentioned before, sticking to the instructions and the protocol throughout the entirety of the evaluation. You will also probably engage in an evaluation of the evaluation, right? So, how did we conduct this evaluation? Did it work for us? Did we have enough resources? Do people have the information that they need? That's also built into the evaluation process, or at least it should be, so that you are also learning about how to conduct meaningful and fruitful evaluations while you're in process of doing it. So, with that said, I wanted all of us to be on the same. I'm going to stop my share. Am I going to stop my share? Can I get there? I have a lot of things at the top of my screen, so it's not letting me do the thing. So I wanted to make sure we all had a foundational understanding of what I mean about evaluation. And now we have ample time to jump into how this manifests itself in the equity perspective. So with that, I welcome questions. You can either raise your hand, put your question in the chat, or unmute. Susan?
Thank you. I like the use of the logic model that you described because you can set stretch goals, long-term goals in a logic model, and you can set intermediate goals and short-term goals. In your opinion, or let me rephrase it, are there some good resources out there that would help us to set realistic and attainable goals in improving diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yes. So there are, I'm trying to think of the search term that I would suggest. equitable equity evaluations is the one that I'm coming up with. There are ways of thinking about the overarching impact that you want to have and looking at, I really like the way that you're talking about short-term, midterm, and long-range goals. Having those explicitly stated is really important because you want to evaluate only for one of those things at a time. And thinking about, okay, we're going to tier this evaluation process so that we can, if you are going with surveys, we're going to write a survey about the short-term impact that we can then replicate those questions for the midterm impact or replicate and expand for the midterm impact. And that will also inform the questions that we ask whenever we want to gauge the long-term impact. And you can put timestamps on that. If you're thinking 1, 3, and 5 years or 3, 6, and 9 months, knowing ahead of time how that's going to work out also helps you plan from an organizational perspective so that it's not a oh crap moment when you're at that time stamp, and it's also grant writing season and you're in the middle of your performance season and you don't have the organizational bandwidth. So I really like the idea of planning out your evaluations and making sure that people have the organizational bandwidth to do it when you're planning on assessing those various like goal markers. Having all levels of staff involved in these conversations are really important because I've one of the things that I've seen organizations sort of shoot themselves in the foot on is it's a very high level conversation because people are thinking it's evaluation and it should be managerial and executive level staff, and these evaluation protocols are set, and then the staff who would actually implement them look at them and are just like, yeah, that's not what our constituents do. That's not the way that they engage with us. That does not make sense. The timing is off. They don't know, like, so making sure that all levels of staff, including volunteers, are in the room whenever you're developing your logic model, whenever you are developing your evaluation question, and definitely whenever you're developing your evaluation protocols. Now, to actually get to your question, sorry it took me so long to get there, but as far as developing the equity questions or the things that you're actually going to look at, it's about operationalizing ideas. So if you want to look at increasing the Latinx engagement with your organization, thinking about what that means in practice. How would that show up for your organization in ways that you would like to see? Right. So increasing engagement means what? More butts and seats, more participation in your classes, increased engagement in artist talkbacks, and that's where you're going to focus your attention. I think one of the biggest challenges is when an organization, well, for me anyway, is when an organization comes to me and they're like, "We tried to assess our relationship with this community," and I was just like, "Okay, well, what about it? Well, the relationship." And then we have a whole who's on first conversation back and forth until we get to what it is that you actually want to see change in your organization. And that goes back to some of the other things that we had talked about in the previous workshops about setting really smart equity goals about the change you want to see and knowing why you want to see that change. Because that, again, should ideally dictate what evaluation questions you're going to ask and the ways in which you go about gathering data. So it should all be interconnected. And it seems like a lot of work, but ideally, your brain juice should just be going towards different aspects of the same sort of thing, right? So we want to be more equitable. So we're looking at our bylaws because we want to increase participation amongst these particular constituents. And as a result of our organizational bylaws and our systemic practices, we've excluded that community in the past. So that impacts the ways in which we would develop programming, which should impact the way that we evaluate all of those things. It was a very long-winded answer, but I hope I got you where you were trying to go. Thanks. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so I will share some questions that people usually ask that you aren't asking. The one thing that I usually get from clients is whenever you're thinking about the goals that you want to set, or you're at that initial like pre-planning phase, how do I know what makes sense for my organization? And this gets back to some of the information that we talked about with building or rebuilding sustainable relationships with different communities, and thinking about your organization's past or current practices, and who you would like to invite into your space that may not already be there. That does require, a pretty deep and meaningful and critically self-reflective conversation about who's not at the table, or who's not in your programming, or who's not considered currently, and the excavating some of the histories behind that, so that whatever decisions you do come to are informed by what has come before, and it's not just a random staking of, we're just going to reach out to this community for reasons, because that's not going to get you very far. So that pre-planning period really does require some critical self-reflection and some organizational unearthing of your past experiences with various communities that might be right next door to you, that you haven't really engaged with previously. I see that there's a question in the chat. Please share an example of movement reporting. Um, so I'm going to answer that part first, and then I'll just ask for clarification now. Linda, could you tell me what you mean by the part that's after the semicolon, the best context and type of evaluation? Or is that a comma expanding upon what you would like me to share about movement-based reporting? There we go.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just unmuted. So I was wondering, what's an example of when you would use that type of reporting, and for what, what's the best context for something like that? I have to admit to not having a clue as to what movement evaluation reporting is.
Yeah.
When's the best time to use it, for what, in what context?
Yeah, anything, really anything that, as far as evaluation outcomes, that might be based in the body or in relationship to one another. So that includes outcomes like increased social awareness, or increased engagement with community. I've seen a lot of, well, not a lot because it's not that common, but I've seen a number of really interesting ways of saying, this is how our program started off, and it might be an individual person, and then there might be some contact improvisation used to demonstrate how a program can impact more and more people. I've seen a flash mob way of demonstrating evaluation outcomes as it comes to social cohesion. I've seen movement-based used to share evaluation results with children. We often collect data on children and then forget to incorporate or include them in the reporting process. But any constituent, any stakeholder that is involved in the data gathering should also be involved in the reporting out. And so sometimes it's a more accessible way of sharing the outcomes. The best.
So, Brea,
go ahead.
Just to clarify, like in what context? So, are we talking once you've gathered the data and you're sharing it back to the participants? I mean, are we talking about a performance on a Zoom? Are we talking about a good context would be at a board meeting in person? Or I'm still sort of unclear about the best context in which to use that.
Yep, so
form
I
of
was just
report.
about to get there. So the
Sorry.
context is, no worries. The context is usually as a performance, and that can happen as a separate performance in your space or as a part of your overall like season. So at the end of our season, we were presenting our results for this evaluation that we conducted, and here's the context of it, and here's what we're conveying with that information. When it's for a particular subset, so maybe if you're thinking about like a literacy program or a education based program, you have your report for the adults, and then you have your movement based thing for the children that you were engaging with, that happens in the context of how they normally engage with their instructor or in the classroom setting. So it really can be calibrated to whom you're sharing the information with. It can be as formal as a performance where you spend some extended time rehearsing and engaging and like staging a full thing. But it can also be as informal as a community gathering where you are saying this is a demonstration of how our program impacts people, and you're demonstrating that in the body through something, like I said, contact improv is the way that I've seen it best used in that context.
Thank you.
I'm an increasing fan of the theater-based one as well, where participants are shown the data results or the evaluation results, and then asked to take part in developing vignettes or stories that they would script, and then maybe either they act out or somebody else would act out to demonstrate their part of the data gathering process to others that weren't necessarily a part of that.
Great. Thanks so much, Brea. If there's no other questions, I don't want to interrupt anybody if they do, but I want to take a second. We're actually, I'm going to pull up a poll. Since this is our last workshop, we have kind of some questions that we'd like to ask everyone here to kind of help us as we're looking at next steps and what do we want to do beyond these workshops and how can we best help with that. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. And it's just got a few questions here. Based on today's workshop, will you be taking next steps with your organization? What are some barriers you face with implementing DEIA into your organization? And then how can Arts Fairfax help with these next steps? And then the final question we have here is, can we share your contact information you provided when you registered to other workshop participants? That was something I got quite a bit, was others wanting to reach out to other workshop participants. And we'd like to just get that permission if you're comfortable with that. So I'll give everybody just a little bit of time. I'm going to give everybody another 30 seconds and then I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And if you see, there's kind of an other category. So if there's things you'd like to add in addition to that, feel free to add that in the comments.
You have a question in the chat about how do you add other comments?
Yeah, I know with the poll, I don't think there's a way to add it. So if you can just do it directly into the chat, that would be great. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. Okay, and then I will share the results. Perfect. Thanks so much, everybody. I see in here we have other ways Arts Fairfax can help from Susan, conducting focus groups among different types of arts organizations, choral ensembles, instrumental ensembles, theater. Great, that's extremely helpful. Thank you so much. So as we're kind of wrapping up, I'd like for everyone to go ahead and type one word describing the session in the chat. And although this is our last workshop in the series, we are going to be working with our advisory group to discuss next steps. And the poll that we just launched is going to be a part of that. So we really appreciate your feedback. The surveys that I send out, we use all of that information, and we're so appreciative of it. And we'll be kind of looking through all of that to kind of see how we can continue to support everyone in this important work. And we'll be sure to keep everybody updated on what will be coming next. If you've missed any of our previous workshops, you'll find that the recordings are available on our website, and I'll be sure to include a link in my follow-up email to everyone. I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen. Just with our last bits, we're wrapping up. So the couple of things to kind of mark your calendars for: the Arts Ignite Recovery Grant application deadline is due on July 21st. And if you missed the information session that was on Tuesday, it will be posted to our website soon. Also, please mark your calendars for the Operating Support Grant final report deadline. That is August 1st. And that form will be made available soon. Here we go. And this is kind of new news. A Pivot Grant application is opening on June 23rd and will be closing at midnight on July 9th. There's some information that's here. I was also told that a constant contact email will be going out shortly this afternoon with all of this information as well. And if you have questions or would like clarification on anything, Dana Stewart is the best contact, and I'll include her email in the follow-up email to everybody. So I'd like to thank Brea first. We're so appreciative that you've worked with us on this series, and it's just been amazing. Just an incredible experience. And I'd also like to thank our advisory group. I know that Niati was on our workshop today, and I know she's been on, I think, all of our other workshops, and we're very appreciative. And for all of you for participating, not only in this workshop, but in our workshop series. And I'd like to take a second just to thank our sponsors: the Arts Forward Fund, Claude Moore Charitable Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, Reston Community Center, and Virginia Commission for the Arts. Thank you, everybody.